Greetings and felicitations.
Hip hip hurrah, tally ho.
Hey Cutie Pie.
Hey Puddin'.
Alright, let's talk about this book that's very rereadable. In fact, we reread it twice. That is The Final Reflection by John M. Ford. Very Klingon-centric book. Released May 1st, 1984 in paperback, and then January of 1985 in hardcover. It has many reprints over the years as well. What does the back of the book say?
Klingon Captain Krenn is a ruthless war strategist, but on a mission to Earth, Krenn learns a lesson in peace. Suddenly he must fight a secret battle of his own. His empire has a covert plan to shatter the Federation. Only Krenn can prevent a war at the risk of his own life.
This I consider one of the Star Trek books that's a must-read. But if you do read it, you have to keep in mind what time period this was written in. Why is that necessary?
Well, there are some things in canon that contradict this book, because John M. Ford was going by what he knew at the time it was written, and later they decided to take the Klingons in a different direction. But this book did influence some things in Star Trek. Even Ronald D. Moore said he read this book and it influenced some of his writing on TNG.
And there were some aspects that were pulled for use in Star Trek Discovery. So by the time this book was released, the only Star Trek that we knew on screen was the original series, the animated series, and the first two Star Trek movies. So that being said, the Klingon culture was wide open for interpretation of what their background was. And I think what was on so many people's minds, especially after the motion picture, was, why do Klingons look different in the original series than they do in Star Trek the Motion Picture? And this book touches on that. And this book also fleshes out the honor code of the Klingons and what their mindset was, what their technology advancements were. I view this as a must-read book because of the fact that it filled in the gaps, whereas no other book of this era did.
So it starts out with a game, and it's a very detailed description of this game. It's like a live-action chess. You actually have the warriors battling, and it's one team against another, but each team has their own person in charge who's sitting back watching the game and telling these players what move to make. And it's just a very interesting description. And for some reason it made me picture Tron when I was reading it. Just seeing seeing a lone character and waiting for something to happen.
I could see that. I was thinking more battle chess or living chess, kind of like what you see on the Prisoner TV show, like an entire board of people, life-size people, actually moving from place to place. But this time they were actually fighting, not just taking over squares.
Yes, and in this one people could move up to different levels, and it seemed like they had, like they couldn't really see in the distance. It was too dark, and you can only see when a character is close to you and about to strike. But it was neat going up to a different level, and you don't know what's going to be on that level, and yeah, things like that. It was such a cool game.
Now, the Klinza board is described as being a triangle instead of a square, and we're getting notations of Klinza. There's no appendix in this book like there was in the Romulan Way, so we can't go back and forth to see what the Klingon words are. But after a while, you're starting to pick up this Klingon language that's featured in the book. Now, this is before Mark Okrand's Klingon Dictionary. This is a Klingon language that was developed before Star Trek III. So, another reason why this is a must-read. It's giving us an idea of what John M. Ford had in mind of what the language would sound like and the common links. So, anytime we see Klin, we know it means Klingon, and then Za is game. And we're seeing a pattern of how words connect in the Klingon language. So that in itself is unique.
A development of the Klingon language and a lot about their culture.
Klingonese. That's what it was called at this time period.
Yes, the language Klingonese. And so they had a thought admiral, which was the one that was the leader of the Klingon military.
Yes.
And a lot of we're in the Klingon assault group. A lot of their things were taken from this book, like the idea of the thought admiral who was in charge of CAG, the Klingon assault group.
Yes, CAG is a Klingon costuming as well as gaming group. It's an international club. We'll put a link in our show notes. Again, we're going influences, how influential this book was. So, influential in multimedia Star Trek as well as in fandom. Another very unique aspect of this book is it established Klingon honorifics. So, you got to figure, in English, we don't have honorifics to a degree. I mean, it would be like sir, maybe, madam. You could address people, but it's not going to be a categoric hierarchy of honorifics. But in Klingonese, the honorifics were prefixes to the surname. Like, for an example, you would say the honorific and then the family name. But this book, unfortunately, did not... You had to discern through the context the level of honorifics. There was not like a list of them in the back of the book.
That was another thing that was adopted by the Klingon assault group, using honorifics. And it's so if you join CAG, they do have on their website a list of those, and they have a list in order, so you'll know the highest and lowest, because the book doesn't really say.
But you're able to discern that it starts out at Tai, then Vestai, then Sutai, then Xantai, and Epitai. But virtually everything that we see with Klingons, with the exception of by the time Deep Space Nine came around for the most part, is everybody in Klingon Empire is involved in some military aspect.
Yeah, they always implied that it's a whole race of warriors, which it really couldn't be. But I mean, because you got to have some people in society that do other things. Like
at Deep Space Nine, you had the guy he was a Klingon chef.
Yeah,
you Klingon opera singer. Right. Yeah, there's other aspects of life, of course. Enterprise, Klingon physicians.
And of course, we've had a Klingon lawyer. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Because I had to read this book over twice in order to understand it even more so. As much as there is a lot to absorb and a lot fleshed out, I didn't think it was an easy read, or I didn't think it was, at times, an enjoyable read. It was kind of jarring how it kept going back and forth. Did you feel the same way?
Well, I'm kind of used to books changing scenes. A lot of the more modern Star Trek books do that now. But it was interesting. Yeah, because sometimes it would move forward in time and didn't really say it. You had to, you're into the next chapter, and then you realize, this is like, the people are older now. And
yes, that's what I'm talking. Whereas modern Star Trek books, it will actually have a date or a star date, something that you could say, all right, this is a future happening, and this is a past happening. So once you sort out how this book is written in your mind, you look at what is expressed here. Some unique concepts. One is that Klingons aged much faster than humans. So what we would consider a middle-aged human would be an older-aged Klingon.
Yeah, they said Klingons have shorter lives, like about 40 years in this one. And we know in canon now that Klingons actually have longer lives than humans. So that was another early thing that was in this book before we knew as much about Klingons. And the other interesting thing was that Klingons, their name changes once they go from a child to an adult. They get a different name, which also makes it confusing when you're reading the book. And now like you're reading about someone with a different name, and you got to make the connection. Oh, it's the same character from before.
Yes, I know that in our discussions with others about it, they said the same thing. It's like you kind of have to sort it out, and it gives explanations of why they changed their name, or even the different developments, the areas of military. Your name will be different depending on where you're serving. That was a unique concept.
And the book doesn't explain that. I read that in the FASA books, and a lot of, John M. Ford, contributed a lot to the FASA books. So it was in FASA that he mentioned about, the ones I believe in the Navy, their name starts with K, and then the ones in some other field, or the Marines, their name starts with M, that kind of thing, and the book doesn't explain that. But you can kind of figure it out, yeah.
Yeah, and that was his way of explaining why on the original series these Klingon names started with K, because they were all on ships.
So the book also mentions, there's a lot about encountering a new culture, and the fact that on Earth at that time there was a group of people who didn't think that humanity should go into space, should not have to deal with other races.
I thought that was fantastic, because this is a principle that was touched upon in the Star Trek Enterprise series.
Yes, and here we see it. Humans' early prejudices against the Klingons, and so there was a whole group of people who were against them, even though they met them. The man Grandison, the human that lived in Atlanta.
Yeah, the book mentioned a hotel with a revolving restaurant on top, and we know that's the Westin, if I'm not mistaken, right? Or is it the Hyatt?
Yes,
right, the Westin.
Yeah, the Westin has a revolving restaurant now, but it was interesting that it's in this book.
And so it's like a Dragon Con connection there.
Yeah, that's what it felt like. So the man, and he was this rich guy, Grandison, that lived there in Atlanta, but actually invited the Klingons, the Klingon Krenn, the one that used to be Vren and now he's Krenn, to go see him. And it was an interesting talk, and you can see how they're just they act pleasant when they talk to each other. But Grandison is also saying that he just doesn't think that Earth should be dealing with other cultures.
And
it's a very good examination of it. Go ahead.
You're right, totally. And what I thought was, again, where I say it was jarring and frustrating sometimes in the read, is it didn't establish right off the bat what time period this was in. But because of that discussion, we're able to discern that this was a prequel to the original series, because part of that discussion, who was involved? But Dr. McCoy's grandfather.
Right. The book has Dr. McCoy as a baby, and later on it has Spock as a little boy, so it's several years before the original series.
Now let's talk about which Klingons were the most prominent, that is visually. We're seeing for the most part, they are the ones that we saw on TOS. But anytime there was one with the ridges on the head, those were called Imperial Klingons. So there were two different types of Klingons, very different than what was expressed in Star Trek Enterprise, the fact that there was a sort of disease taking over the Klingons and they lost their ridges. No, there were just different factions of Klingons. This was expressed more in John Ford's FASA books, that there would be fusion Klingons designed to look more human because of the fact that they could work with Klingons better or infiltrate humanoid colonies better.
It made sense at the time. But then, of course, on Deep Space Nine, we had the three Klingons from the original series that were smooth-headed, and then on Deep Space Nine, they had the ridges. So Enterprise did a better job of explaining that. But since that problem didn't exist when this book was written, I do like this explanation. It was much simpler.
And so anytime an Imperial Klingon was mentioned, and you still hear some old-school Star Trek fans call the rigid-head Klingons Imperial Klingons, it came from this book. Now, we've been saying multiple times John M. Ford's connection with FASA. So, for those who just read books that listen to this review, explain, please, what the FASA role-playing game is that we play on a regular basis.
So it's a role-playing game for Star Trek, just like Dungeons & Dragons is a role-playing game. So this one is, FASA for Star Trek is the one where you get to be an officer on a ship, and it's role-playing. You create your own character, and you go through this adventure scenario.
And what was amazing is that FASA actually hired a Star Trek author to flesh out the Klingon aspects of the game. So books that were written through FASA, that is the company that produced this game, John M. Ford had a massive hand in it. So throughout the 80s and a good amount of the 90s, when questions about Klingons came up, people referred to the FASA manuals that were Klingon-based.
Well, and the manuals had so much more. Because they were actually pretty large books if you wanted to read the whole thing. So it's like they said a lot more, filled in a lot more holes about Klingons.
And this book, we have to mention, does have a bookend, sort of. It's an in-universe book. I think this is the only Star Trek book that I've ever read where this is the final reflection, that is a Klingon book that was essentially a bestseller and everyone was talking about it. And the beginning of the book and the end of the book shows people on the Enterprise sharing this book around to get a better idea of the Klingon culture. And it was a controversial book because the final reflection in universe in Star Trek was actually sympathizing to the Klingon cause to a degree.
That was an interesting take. Now, there was another book, Strangers from the Sky, that was also a book.
And that references the final reflection,
which does reference this book. Yeah, Strangers from the Sky was also another frame story where it was the name of a book in universe and a book that we read. But it was good how the final reflection showed that, like it's a Klingon story that takes place in the past, but it also has the framing story that has Kirk saying, and in the end, he said that he would really look at Klingons differently after reading this book. And yeah, that was interesting because it had, because the book has the character who was a human who went to live with the Klingons for several years. But there was a human who lived with the Klingons several years, and so that is the human who wrote the book, The Final Reflection. And it was a man who sympathized with the Klingons and really saw the beauty of their race. And I think it's great that he had the Klingon Krenn to work with, because the Krenn was also very understanding of humans. I think he got humans just like the other human got the Klingons, in the idea of what they wanted and why they did what they did. And Krenn even saying that, or even understanding that humans, some humans said, well, it's not that they were interested in taking Klingon territory. And Krenn said he believes that, but he doesn't think that his superiors in the Klingon military would believe it. So there are things like that. Well, he knows his views, and he knows the views of other Klingons that are more powerful.
Also of note, it talks about Klingon technology. And if you are a collector of Star Trek books, you might have Star Trek Spaceflight Chronology, another excellent reference book that this book does touch on. This was a time period in the mid-'80s where there was a lot of Star Trek material out, and the writers were trying to connect things together. They were trying to build a cohesive universe because there was nothing regularly available on TV that could do this. So I love to see that this world building that authors were able to take a chance at developing. But with regards to technology, this revealed that Klingons actually developed a much more advanced technology of transporters than the Federation had.
That was interesting too, and it was sort of an extrapolation from the TV show where the Klingon transporter looked different and it didn't have a sound. So why not say that theirs is more advanced because it didn't make that awful sound,
Absolutely. And they felt that there was an advantage because they could actually beam somewhere and sneak up on people. They had more of a tactical advantage with this type of technology.
And it was interesting how the Klingons didn't know whether or not they should share the transport. They didn't know if humans had any type of transporter at first, but they didn't know if they should share that technology. And then the humans decided, oh, let's share our technology with them. So they're showing them the transporter, and then they find out the Klingons already had one.
So there was elements of cultural exchange there. We see that the Klingons were much more advanced with cryogenics as well as bionics, something we've never seen on television.
Yeah, we haven't seen that the Klingons can do that, so that was just a new thing in this book, and that was cool too, as far as what they could do with it. They made actual use of their cryogenics, which made sense because, humans just wanting to do it to live longer, which is fine, and you would think, yeah, and since the Klingons have short lives, you would think they want to use it for that too, but they also used it for something else to make their killing machines.
Speaking of which, we saw essentially a $6 million Klingon in this book.
Yeah, a Klingon who was stronger and faster, definitely.
Which I loved. It totally makes sense. They were adding things to this book that would be totally unaffordable on a screen.
Also mentioned in the book, the Kinshaya, they were an enemy race of the Klingons, and the Kinshaya were used later on in Star Trek books. They became part of the Typhon Pact in the post-Nemesis books. They were a very interesting race. And also the book, just going back to the game, I love some of their words that they mentioned. The word Comarex, which means technically it was translated to mean empire, but Krenn said that's not exactly what it means. It means the structure that grows. So an empire is something that keeps growing. And the opposite of that is Kesterex, which means the structure that dies, which means if you don't keep growing, you're going to die. They thought of those two words as opposites.
Again, we're going back to the Klingonese language, which when they wouldn't always explain the words. You had to infer it by the sentence around it. But when they did break down words, all this did was humanize the Klingons. Previously, all we knew about Klingons in the Star Trek universe is that they were warmongers and they just wanted to conquer. When we break down the Klingon words and we understand the Klingon culture more, we're seeing that they actually have, and they use this word multiple times, they're doing things for the sake of honor. I don't ever remember Klingons depicted as being honorable until Next Generation.
No, I don't think so. They kind of changed the Klingons and the Romulans. It seems like sometimes the writers got the two races mixed up. But I also thought this book was similar to Star Trek VI in the idea of
Yes.
trying to make peace with the cultures.
Oh, I totally agree there.
And they also had the Comarex Za. There was the Klin Za, the game that they played in the beginning, but the Comarex Za was the game of the Empire, or the game of the growing culture, also known as the Perpetual Game.
That is, Za is the Klingonese
Yes.
word for game. Yeah, explain a little bit more the Perpetual Game, because this all goes around the theme of life is a game.
That's how I saw it. It's the game of life, or it's just living your life and realizing that it's growing, that it's always going to be happening. Something is always happening. It's always changing and growing.
And it has to have a purpose.
Yes. So very interesting pieces of the Klingon culture. It does make you stop and think they're not just they're not just warriors. They're also thoughtful people who have these ideas, and they know where they're going from. There's a purpose just besides killing people. There's actually a purpose behind it. And Tabor, right, was the name of the human who wrote the final reflection. He was the one who understood Klingons and became friends with the Klingon Krenn.
Why do you think this book was so controversial throughout the Federation?
Because the humans wanted to think that the Klingons were their enemies, and that they were threatened by the Klingons, feared that the Klingons wanted to expand into their territory, which was true, but it was mostly fear. And so seeing this book and seeing how Klingons are not really as bad or evil as we thought they were, that's scary, getting to know your enemy and finding out they don't exactly have to be your enemy. They don't have to be these bad guys.
And this was a lesson in prejudice. For years, humans had prejudice. They had this idea of, and we know that there were factions of humans that were anti-alien. They did not want to know. They wanted to keep an enemy. And we know that Gene Roddenberry, later on, through Star Trek Next Generation and Star Trek VI had parallels to the Cold War of the more we understand beings that are different than us, if we understand the similarities, we could break down those walls of prejudice. And, the end of the book really wrapped up in some people asking themselves those hard questions. Do I really want to drop these walls of bigotry and view them as just different beings with different ideas, not as my enemy?
Yes, and the thing is, well, we saw what happened in Star Trek later. The Klingons definitely became the Federation's enemy. But it's like you still have to keep this in mind. So this book focused on certain characters, and the Klingon Empire, the ones who were actually in charge, did see it like they did have to expand. You have to think of it like the people higher up in the Klingon Empire didn't get to know the humans as well.
Mm-hmm.
But if they had, then maybe there would have been peace sooner.
What were some of your favorite parts of the book that you walk away with? You're saying this was a satisfying read for these reasons.
Because of the way the characters just came to life, and the way Krenn thought of humans as not exactly his enemies. And you'll see scenes later where he proved that, where he actually tried to keep the peace as much as he could from his position. And seeing how his character works was very enlightening.
Yeah, to me it was getting more understanding of the pre-TNG Klingon background, to understand how their society works, how their culture acts and feels about different matters mentally. That was intriguing because this is an era of there was not enough information on Klingons, and especially as role-playing gamers, this is a book that we're able to see the Klingon culture and the Klingon way of life in such a different light than what we've seen on screen. And I think that in itself is interesting.
And it's interesting that later on with the novels, that there was a short time period where that they couldn't add anything new to the Star Trek universe. It was actually stated. So for a while the novels just had to have the characters being who they were and couldn't be fleshed out more and couldn't add more about the Klingons. So it's so great that this novel was written when it was, when they could actually add more and expand on the Klingon culture, and we could learn so much more about them. Even if later on some of it was wiped out, it was still great to see this.
Oftentimes, this is considered the FASA-verse Klingons. That's how much of an impact that this book made to the role-playing game. Obviously, same author for the Klingon-based adventures in the FASA role-playing game, but it's its own pocket universe to a degree.
Yeah, a pocket universe like the pocket books that published Star Trek. So it was a great world to be in back then in the 80s, to read this book when there wasn't much else around. And the portrayal of the Vulcans in this was interesting. The Klingons actually had Vulcan servants. They were
totally
actually
need to address that. Yeah. Yes.
Considered slave. They were slaves, really. And what did it say about their minds?
So they took out the telepathic part of their brain, and this was a way that they were able to see what life would be like without this added advantage. So it was kind of sort of a willful slave. Did you get that out of it?
Yes, I did. And I read, I think it was in the FASA books that I read this, that there's like the willing slave can be honorable if it's there's a certain path that certain races have in life. So if it's your path to be a slave and you follow that path, then that's honorable. But if it's your path to be a leader and you don't follow that path, then that's dishonorable.
As I was reading that, I was like, why would anybody allow themselves to be lobotomized for the fact of seeing what life would be like with an ability hindered? But there are humans that actually seek a life of poverty, that sometimes do things that are detrimental to their physical well-being, because that's a spiritual high ground for them, a spiritual enlightenment. So it's not that far-fetched. So this book actually gives us a unique facet of Vulcan culture as well.
And I think it's because the Vulcans are considered peaceful. I mean, I think that's why the writer put that in the book, because the Klingons are more warlike, and so it just, so you sort of reason out that they would enslave Vulcans that are more peaceful. But you see how but he kind of put a twist to it, which was awesome, just making it, well, that the Vulcans wanted to do this.
Excellent point. Yeah, that's why I had to read this book twice within 5 years. The first time reading it, because I really didn't like the flow of it, and then there are certain times where explanations of things came up later than sooner. I had a hard time visualizing scenes or people in my mind. But then the second read through, I already had the advantage of seeing how things wrapped up. So this was able to develop easier for me.
The book was very complex. So yeah, you get more out of it reading it more than once. Another mystery in the book was Krenn's heritage. So there, at the beginning of the book, they said his father died, but then later in the book, you see that, like they're not sure now if his father that he thought was really his father.
Kind of ambiguous.
Yeah, I mean that was interesting too, just to make it so that this guy, the main character, doesn't really know who he is. He was adopted by the Thought Admiral for a time, but then the Thought Admiral was killed with dishonor. So now you have this guy with no family, but he's going to build his own house. And
this is a 10-year-old that's running a ship.
Yeah.
At first, that's another thing that was just so confusing to me. Why is this 10-year-old doing all these things and nobody thinks it's odd? You have to get through halfway through the book saying, well, it's because that Klingons have to develop sooner because their lifespan is so much shorter. Oh, okay, I wish you said that at the beginning. That way I wasn't so confused of just picturing a 10-year-old running operations on a ship. Again, something that we never saw in the original series, and they changed drastically in TNG. So it's you have to almost forget everything you know about Star Trek when you're reading this book, because it literally is a different view of Klingon culture than anything that we know from the mid-'80s going forward.
How do you rate this?
I'm going to have to make this a rating with an asterisk. The asterisk is it was a very confusing read at times, but I did find it so fascinating, so intriguing, the details about pre-TNG Klingon culture and society and way of doing things. Because it is such a necessary book to read, especially if you're a gamer, I'm going to give this 4 Quatlus.
4 out of 5, you said?
Yes. That's
probably about where I would say. I'll just say 4.5 Quatlus, because I thought it was really an awesome book. And I probably wouldn't have rated it that high the first time I read it.
I would not have either.
Yeah.
This is like lasagna. It's way better the second time around.
Definitely. So, a great book. Great read. Highly recommend. Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.